Hello, my name is Albie Miles. I am Assistant Professor of Sustainable Community Food Systems at the University of Hawaii, west Oahu. And what I want to cover today is the role of agriculture in climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. So first, I want to talk a little bit about climate change and agriculture and some of the risks and contributions of agriculture to climate change. Then I'm going to address the scientific literature and what it says about biologically based and diversified farming systems and the ecosystem services, including those that are relevant to climate change and adaptation and mitigation. And then I'm going to end with a brief overview of the political and economic context in which some of the ecologically based research that I'll be covering exists. So let's start with some of the basics. Most of you are familiar with this trend in CO2 concentrations. So since the Industrial Revolution, we've had an increase in CO2 levels with the combustion of fossil energy reserves. At present, we have now exceeded 400 parts per million of CO2 in the Earth's upper atmosphere, and that is driving increases in global temperature. The next slide shows the mean concentration of CO2 over the last few years. And as I'll bring your attention to the current state of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere as measured at Mauna Loa Observatory. So at present we have CO2 concentrations now exceeding 400 parts per million on average. So it just recently exceeded 404 parts per million as measured at Mauna Loa. That's an important number because it is now understood by the scientific community that 350 parts per million are the upper threshold for what is considered to be safe in terms of climate stability. So we have now exceeded 400 parts per million mean CO2 concentrations in the Earth's upper atmosphere. That is far and above what is considered to be stable. So to summarize, we are at 400 plus parts per million of CO2 concentration in the Earth's upper atmosphere. Where we need to be is closer to 350 parts per million or below. The recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out in 2014 had a number of important findings. So what the international climate scientific community is now stating is that at the current rate of emissions, we will reach an average of 2 degrees centigrade of warming. That is an increase above pre-industrial levels by 2030. So in the next 15 years, we will reach the upper threshold for global warming that is considered to be safe. If we continue without abating the current rate of greenhouse gas emissions, we can anticipate increasing the global average temperature above pre-industrial levels by 4 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. And what the IPCC has recently reported is their anticipation, if we are to achieve 4 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, it is likely going to result in catastrophic impacts, that is social, economic, and ecological impacts. It's understood that about 2 degrees of warming we can still manage to mitigate and adapt, but there will still be significant losses to ecosystems and human lives in certain parts of the world. Huge numbers of people will be displaced, and there will be widespread food insecurity because of crop losses and spiraling food prices. This illustration and the reference below is based on recent modeling that NASA has done, and it shows in the areas in dark brown the regions of the continental United States that are anticipated to experience long-term droughts or megadroughts. So the darker the area, the drier it is anticipated to be for the remainder of this century. And what is understood that, based on these climate models, is that the remainder of this century will likely be drier than at any point in the last 1,000 years. And without significant greenhouse gas emissions abatement, then we can expect droughts taking place in the continental United States that last between 10 and up to 40 years in length. Droughts of that magnitude, of course, would have significant social, economic, and ecological impacts. We know from measuring the recession of the polar ice caps and the frozen water resources on the Greenland ice sheet that we are experiencing significant declines in the frozen ice masses around the globe. And so you're seeing here in this image the minimum average ice coverage from 1979 to 2010 to the left, and now as of 2012, the minimum ice coverage as of September 16th. You're seeing a significant decline in the overall Greenland ice sheet, and that resulting in an impact on sea level rise. In total, we're seeing, as we measure the Arctic sea ice extent and the Arctic sea ice volume, you're seeing a decline of both extent or surface area and volume. So we're seeing a rapid and significant decline in Arctic sea ice extent and volume, and that also contributing to sea level rise. So though this may not look significant, we are seeing the slow increase in sea level rise around the globe. And so without mitigation and without significant changes to greenhouse gas emissions, then sea level rise will continue unabated. In the continental United States, it's anticipated, based on approximations of sea level rise of 1 meter by the turn of this next century, that many parts of the continental United States along the margins, along the coastlines, will become inundated on a regular basis. So this is an illustration of Florida and much of the southern coastline near Florida. And you're seeing in the red the areas that will be inundated with 1 meter of sea level rise. It's important to understand, though, carbon dioxide is one of the most dominant greenhouse gases that results from the combustion of fossil fuel, that there are other greenhouse gases that we produce as human society that have direct relevance to agriculture, as we'll be discussing. So it's important to understand that in addition to CO2, nitrous oxide and methane are also significant greenhouse gases, and though they may be less dominant, they are in many instances much more potent than CO2. So you see here in this illustration that the warming potential of nitrous oxide is 300 times that of carbon dioxide, and methane is 25 times more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. So turning to agriculture. So agriculture accounts for approximately 25 and as much as 35% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. So in this illustration, you see this pie chart with agriculture and forestry and energy supply broken down. In the example of agriculture at 14%, that's just the production side. But when you begin to add up the total inputs into agriculture, the chemical inputs, the transportation, the areas that are cleared for forestry that then turn into agricultural lands, the total greenhouse gas emissions are now estimated between 25 and 35%. So agriculture is having an outsized influence on greenhouse gas emissions globally. Some of the key drivers of greenhouse gas emissions are listed here. So the top four, deforestation and land use change, Animal agriculture has a significant contribution, synthetic chemical fertilizers, and intensive tillage. There's a range of other contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, and they're listed below. Number 5, agricultural inputs, food waste, animal manures, wetland rice paddies, and transportation and refrigeration all contribute significantly, but some of the greatest ones are those listed in 1 through 4, and I'll explain each of those sequentially. It's important to understand that modern industrial agriculture produces greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental externalities in a number of different ways, and I'll spend some time discussing those next. So modern industrial agriculture is largely done as monocultures, large-scale industrial monocultures of single crop species planted over large tracts of land. These farming systems can be highly productive, but they come with a number of unanticipated and unintentional environmental costs. One of the significant contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, as I mentioned, is the production and use of synthetic chemical fertilizers. So ammonium nitrate, for example, these materials are produced through a highly energy-intensive chemical process known as a Haber-Bosch process. And in the process of producing synthetic chemical fertilizers, a tremendous amount of energy is used. So fossil energy is used in the production, and then greenhouse gas emissions result, but also in the breakdown of this material in the soil. So this shows an increase in nitrous oxide concentrations since the 1940s. And what is shown is that there's an increased fertilizer use that has resulted from the increased application of these synthetic chemical inputs for agriculture. And there's a direct link between the utilization of synthetic chemical fertilizer and increased concentration of nitrous oxide in the Earth's upper atmosphere. This is important because, as previously mentioned, nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. It's less prevalent, but it is a significantly more potent greenhouse gas. So both on the production side and as this material breaks down in the soil, it is producing significant volumes of greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, another unintended consequence of the overuse of synthetic chemical fertilizer is the impact on crop plant physiology. So now what's understood is when plants are over-fertilized, they become more susceptible to pests and pathogens, and training farming systems to increase reliance on synthetic chemical inputs. So beyond the issue of synthetic chemical fertilizers' contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, we're also creating the conditions in which crop plants are more susceptible to pests and pathogens. Let's now turn to soil tillage. Modern industrial agriculture is highly dependent upon intensive tillage for soil preparation for planting seeds and seedlings. This has an important impact for a number of reasons. Repeated tillage increases the rate of oxidation of organic matter. And this image here shows an example of a plot of soil that was once under native vegetation around 1905. And as it was converted to agricultural management and it was conventionally tilled for many decades, the organic matter content, or the soil carbon content, decreases through time. You see the line arcing downward from about 1905 until about 1950, where it plateaus. So as we use tillage, which is essential in many farming systems, it tends to decrease the organic matter content of the soil. And as the organic matter content is oxidized, large amounts of carbon dioxide are liberated from the soil. So CO2 is released from the soil as microorganisms decompose soil organic matter, creating large plumes of CO2 that we cannot see leaving the soil. So that has both an impact on climate change by contributing large volumes of CO2, but it also is a significant influence on overall soil quality and fertility, because as we decrease the carbon concentration or the carbon content of soils, we diminish the energy and nutrient resources that are essential for maintaining soil quality and fertility. In this example, in this slide, you will also see the beginnings of an experiment where reduced tillage or conservation tillage was imposed around 1960. And you see through time, as a result of decreasing the amount of tillage, you see a slight increase in the organic carbon content of that soil. So depending upon the management techniques, we can actually restore various degrees of soil carbon that had been removed. So it's possible to restore degraded soils that have lost significant amounts of soil organic carbon. And that's what I want to turn to toward the latter part of this talk. The role of soil organic carbon is essential to the process of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. Soils are one of the largest potential sinks of CO2 that we have available, and it can influence positively the physical, chemical, and biological properties of soil, making them both more climate resilient, but also raising their overall productivity. Associated with modern industrial agriculture, with the use of synthetic chemical fertilizer and intensive tillage, one of the other unintended consequences is that soils become more eroded. They're more susceptible to erosion. So as the organic matter content declines, it compromises a key soil quality characteristic called aggregate stability, the ability of soil particles to bind and hold on to one another. So soils, as they decrease in their organic matter content, and the CO2 is emitted into the Earth's upper atmosphere, we're degrading key soil quality characteristics. And as the organic matter content declines, soil aggregate stability declines and soils become more erosive. And if we're using concentrated chemical fertilizers that are highly water soluble with these events of erosion, and I'll have you turn your attention to the right-hand picture, when soils and the nutrients that are contained in those soils eventually enter freshwater and aquatic, freshwater and marine aquatic ecosystems, then those nutrients that are contained in them, originally intended for producing agricultural plants, they fertilize the algae that exist in aquatic ecosystems, leading to the process of eutrophication, the blooms of algae deriving from the excess nutrients that are entering into those systems. And eventually what will happen is, once the algae blooms begin to die, then as they're decomposing, they create an increased biological oxygen demand on the system, and it can decrease the available oxygen to other species, resulting in a decline in the overall biodiversity of those aquatic ecosystems, be they freshwater or marine. Here is another image showing the unintended consequence of eutrophication, directly derived from agricultural production and the use of concentrated fertilizers for production agriculture. So each place that you see a white little dot, that's a hypoxic system or a hypoxic zone. And you see them concentrated around all the major river mouths and places throughout the world. And one of the most notorious ones is in the Gulf of Mexico. You see a cluster of hypoxic zones around the Gulf of Mexico. So as a result of the continental agriculture along the Mississippi River, you have vast amounts of agricultural fertilizers, concentrated ammonium nitrate fertilizer, entering into these riverways and eventually making their way down into the Gulf of Mexico. And the process that I described in terms of eutrophication unfolding. And the Gulf of Mexico is understood as one of the larger hypoxic zones that we have in the world today. But everywhere where you see a small little dot on this global map, you see major hypoxic zones that are derived from eutrophication and nutrient pollution from agriculture. Another central component of modern industrial agriculture, as I mentioned, is monocultural production. And one of the other unintended consequences of monoculture production is that we create the conditions which are optimal for pest and pathogen growth. So as we're concentrating plant host resources under large tracts of land in these monocultures, we're creating the conditions in which a potential pest organism like an insect or a plant pathogen can grow in an uninterrupted way. So as we're simplifying these agricultural ecosystems, we're concentrating plant host resources that enable pest populations to grow exponentially. At the same time, we're destroying non-crop habitat that could support populations of beneficial insects that could otherwise keep these pest populations in check. So as a result, we have a decreased natural level of pest regulation, whether it's insects or plant pathogens, and an increase in specialized herbivore or pest organisms that impact these crop plants. And as a result, we have increased crop loss or crop damage. And then as a result, farmers are more dependent on the use of synthetic chemical pest control agents in order to control these pest populations. So in summary, what we're doing is we're concentrating these pest host resources in one large area, and we're creating the conditions in which pests and pathogens will grow uninterruptedly. So it's important to understand that the way that we are designing modern agricultural ecosystems is ecologically dysfunctional. As I mentioned, when we grow crops in large-scale monocultures, we're concentrating plant host resources, and it often creates the increased pressure for farmers to use various synthetic pest control materials in order to control the inevitable outbreak of pests and pathogens that grow in these farming systems. What we should know, understanding the fundamentals of evolution by natural selection, is that at the same time that we are attempting to control these pest and pathogen populations, we are driving the development of genetic resistance. So this image shows the process of the development of genetic resistance to pesticides. So in the left-hand image, you see a population of, we'll say, aphids, and there's a red one in there, and that has a natural genetic makeup that makes it more resistant to exposure to toxic materials. When we apply a pesticide, what will happen is that a number of those that do not have the genetic trait of resistance, they will die off, leaving behind those that have the genetic trait of resistance. And you see through time that those with a genetic trait of resistance will be amplified in subsequent population. And through time, as we increase the application of these pest control materials, only those that have the genetic trait will be selected for and survive, reproduce, and transferring that genetic trait into subsequent generations. So through time, what we're doing is creating genetic variants of pests and pathogens that are resistant to the materials that we're using to try to control these pest populations. At the same time, if you turn to the image on the right, there's a number of examples of natural enemies of agricultural pests. When we use these synthetic chemical materials, we are simultaneously driving the development of genetic resistance while negatively impacting these predators and parasitoids that could otherwise keep pest populations in check. Okay, going back to greenhouse gas emissions. So now with the increased scale of production worldwide of commodity crops, you're seeing a significant conversion of primary forest land into agriculture. And these are a couple of examples of the Brazilian Amazon being converted into soybean production, And in the right-hand image, you see palm oil production being planted in what was primary forest. So in the process of converting primary forest to agricultural land, of course, a tremendous amount of greenhouse gases are produced in the clearing and burning of that biomass, but also because of the materials and the techniques that are used in modern industrial agriculture, once those systems are in place, large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions are produced. So what's now happening is, as an increased amount of forest land is being conserved and we're doing less clear cutting of forests and burning off of the biomass, we're seeing that the agricultural production systems themselves are increasingly playing a dominant role in greenhouse gas emissions. So because of the techniques that are used in agriculture, production agriculture is now exceeding the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that was once being produced as a result of our forestry practices. It's important to understand that animal agriculture plays also a very significant role in greenhouse gas emissions, and that again has to do with the techniques or the practices that we use in producing animals under an industrial model. So this shows, this is an image of cattle at a feeding lot, and those cattle are more than likely consuming corn, which I want to touch on briefly. So it's important to understand that just in the way that we produce animals today, there is a significant level of inefficiency in the way that we are producing animal proteins. So in order to produce animal proteins, there's a varying range of food conversion efficiency. So on the left-hand side, you see beef cattle, and that shows a very high level of food conversion efficiency. That is, in order to produce a unit of consumable food, it takes a significant number of food units in order to produce that food. So in the case of beef, we're looking at a 7-to-1 ratio. So in order to produce a 1 pound of beef protein, it will take 7 pounds of grain protein in order to produce that 1 pound of animal protein. And as you go down the line from cattle to pigs to chickens and then to fish, you're seeing higher rates of efficiency. So simply by virtue of the fact that we are feeding animals grain and then consuming the animals, embedded in that process of feeding animals grain, we're creating a highly inefficient process of producing consumable animal proteins. Digging a little bit deeper into this case study and its implications for climate change, it's important to understand that a significant amount of acreage is allocated to producing grains for animal production. So in the continental United States, we produce about 100 million acres of corn. A large amount of that is going into the production of animal feed and biofuels, both of which are producing significant amounts of greenhouse gases. Here you see a breakdown. This is USDA data looking at the major uses of corn in the United States. So an overwhelming majority of the corn that's produced in the United States is being allocated to feed, that's in the blue, and then alcohol use for fuel. So biofuels is a second major use of corn in the United States, and then a very small percentage, maybe 10%, is used for actual human food and other industrial uses. So the overwhelming majority of the corn, the 100 million acres of corn that's grown in the United States, is being used for feeding animals or for biofuels production. Both of those processes producing significant amounts of greenhouse gases. Again, looking at the animal agriculture and grain production and use, you see that U.S. feed grain production in 2015 and 16, the overwhelming majority of that was corn. And that corn that is produced for feed, 95% of all of the feed grain that's produced in the United States is corn, and that is being used to feed livestock in a very inefficient process of producing animal proteins, with significant greenhouse gases being produced along the way. So this system of industrial agriculture that I've been describing is at significant variance to traditional forms of agriculture. I want to spend some time discussing as a counterpoint. So traditionally, traditional farming systems from all over the world maintain soil quality and fertility in very different ways, and I want to break down some of these details. So the way, before the advent of synthetic chemical fertilizers, the way that traditional farmers had maintained soil quality and fertility is through the cycling of organic matter. And it was through the cycling of organic matter that all essential plant nutrients were provided to crop plants, and that soil quality and fertility was maintained. And the ways that soil organic matter was cycled is through composting, the use of cover cropping, especially leguminous nitrogen-fixing cover crops, the use of animal manures, the use of human waste, and then the collection of forest litter and even marine algae were all used to provide essential plant nutrients and organic matter to the soil system that maintain the soil quality and fertility for, in many cases, thousands of years. At the same time, traditional farming systems around the world had always maintained a great diversity of crops, both in space and time. They had these highly diversified farming systems with regionally selected varieties of plants and animals that were bred to be resistant to pests and pathogens, among other features that they were selected for. Traditional farming systems always practiced crop rotation and included fallow periods. All of these strategies maintained soil quality and fertility and served as preventative pest management strategies to prevent the buildup of pests and pathogens. And then also in many traditional farming systems from around the world, there was much less tillage that was done, and therefore less oxidation of organic matter resulting. So the set of practices that traditional farmers had used throughout the world prior to the development of the Green Revolution, all of these practices served to maintain soil quality and fertility, produce very high yields, and increased often the organic matter content of the soil by virtue of cycling large amounts of organic matter and essential plant nutrients. So I present that as a point of departure from the modern industrial model of agriculture. We have now studied traditional agricultural systems from all over the world, and as a result of observing them for decades, we can derive certain principles for agroecosystem management that serve to restore soil quality and fertility, among other critical ecosystem services that we can then use in our attempts to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So this is a schematic diagram of an alternative pest management strategy. So what I had described in terms of the modern industrial model of agriculture is in the lower section. And so this shows the ways that we tend to practice agriculture today. So looking at the lower example, we tend to grow crops as monocultures. We tend to use a lot of chemical fertilization. We tend to remove all non-crop vegetation. We tend to use a lot of intensive mechanical tillage and other inputs such as pesticides. As a result, it tends to decrease the natural enemy species diversity and abundance and limits our ability to rely on natural pest regulation for providing that essential ecosystem service of biological pest control. So studying traditional farming systems and conventional farming systems, we can now develop new forms of agriculture that draw upon the practices of traditional farming systems but use modern empirical sciences to redesign modern farming systems to function on a new set of ecological bases. So now we understand that if we do just the opposite of what is the trend in modern agriculture, and we diversify biologically in space and time the farming system through such things as polycultures, crop rotation, the use of cover crops, the management of soil organic matter, and minimize soil disturbance and increase the amount of non-crop vegetation in and around the farming system, we can create the conditions in which natural enemy species diversity and abundance is enhanced, and as a result we lower pest population density. So I present that as an alternative model of agroecosystem design. So we have for decades now pursued an industrial model of agriculture that has been incredibly productive, but it also has produced a number of significant environmental externalities, particularly those having to do with climate change. And so I present this as an alternative framework for how we can approach agriculture from an ecologically based or an agroecologically based foundation. Here's another example of an ecologically based farming system. So in East Africa, we have a significant pest problem. It's called the corn borer. It is a lepidopteran pest that is known to devastate crop plants and has led to food insecurity at various times in East Africa. So using our understanding of ecology based on some of these principles of biological diversification in space and time, we can redesign these farming systems to function on a new set of ecological relationships, and that is what I want to describe here as another example of agroecology before I jump into a review of the literature and what it says in total. So this is an example of agroecology as applied to East African farming systems. So as opposed to farming these crops as monocultures, corn as monocultures, what ecologists have figured out is if they intercrop different plants, they can significantly decrease pest population densities without using any kind of synthetic chemical pest control and restore soil organic matter and soil quality and fertility simultaneously. So let me describe what's happening here. So you see the rows of corn. Planted between the rows of corn is a nitrogen-fixing leguminous plant called Desmodium. And Desmodium not only fixes nitrogen that then provides nutrients to the soil and subsequent crop plants, but it is a repellent plant that drives the corn borer out of the farming system. So it has a chemical signal that the lepidopteran pest, the corn borer, does not like, and it serves as a push factor out of the corn system. On the outside of the corn system, they plant a grass that's called Napier grass, and that has a chemical property that the corn borer finds attractive. And so you have these two forces, both a push and a pull, where the lepidopteran pest is driven out of the system and attracted to the Napier grass. And as a result, the breeding pairs of moths decreases significantly, and the damage done to the crop plant decreases significantly. So all of this being accomplished without the use of any kind of synthetic chemical fertilizer or pest control agents. At the same time, the Desmodium, as I mentioned, is a nitrogen-fixing cover crop. It covers the soil, it adds organic matter, and it's something that the grazing animals in that farming system can use so they can increase their overall productivity. So this is an ingenious solution using our understanding of ecology to solve a pest management problem and increase the soil quality and fertility simultaneously. So what I want to turn to now, I've provided a couple examples, a theoretical model for agroecological design of farming system, provided you with an example of how agroecology can be used to solve a pest problem. Now I want to turn to a review of the scientific literature. This is a quantitative summary of the existing scientific literature about these biologically based and diversified farming systems and what they say about the range of ecological services, including climate change adaptation and mitigation, that these different types of farming systems provide. So this is a comparative analysis of conventional and biologically based and biologically diversified farming systems. It was intended as an analysis of the state of the science. What can we actually say about the functioning of these different models of agriculture, biologically based and diversified versus conventional or biologically simplified farming systems? So what do we know in terms of the overall performance of these two dominant models of agriculture? So when we say biological diversification in agriculture, what I'm talking about is a range of different types of diversification, and that can be from the diversity of different varieties in a cropping system, as represented by the diversity of seed in the upper left. It can be biological diversification of the soil ecosystem by adding organic matter, as you see the two women sifting compost in the upper center. It can include diversification of crops in space, as shown in the upper right. It can include such things as cropping in the understory of a native forest. In the case of the middle right, that's an example of a coffee agroecosystem in the understory of a tropical forest. The very center is an example of biological diversification through the use of a range of different cover crop species, some of which are nitrogen fixers. In the middle left, that's showing a rice intercrop with fish, another form of biological diversification that can enhance overall productivity. The bottom left shows large fields, but with remnant forest interspersed throughout this agricultural landscape that can serve as refugia for beneficial organisms and prevent nutrients from flowing into riparian ecosystems. Those can also play important functions in terms of delivering ecosystem services. The bottom center, you see an insect feeding on some flowering plants, so the integration of non-crop vegetation into farming systems is another form of biological diversification. And then at a larger scale, looking at a diversity of crops being grown in a given landscape. All of those different forms of biological diversification have been studied in different ways and have been repeated through time, and what our study does is tries to provide a quantitative synthesis of all the existing studies that compare biologically based and biologically diversified farming systems to those of conventional monocultures. Okay, so our intention was to provide this quantitative summary of the scientific literature so that we have an empirical basis upon which we can argue that one type of farming system is performing better than another. And so what we assessed is a range of different ecosystem services, and they're listed below. So everything from biodiversity to soil quality enhancement, water use efficiency, pest control, pollination services, and then those that are particularly important to climate change adaptation and mitigation, carbon sequestration, energy use, total global warming potential, resistance and resilience to severe weather conditions, and then productivity. So let's look at what our methodology was. When we surveyed the scientific literature, we were looking for studies drawing extensively from what are called meta-analyses, the integration of multiple studies in determining what the mean impact is, and long-term studies. And what we found is that there was a range of different impacts, and we categorized them as follows. So we summarized those studies that have a strong positive effect, those having a greater than 25% change with diversification and a very low p-value, as being a strong impact of biological diversification. Those having a weak effect, we categorize that as with diversification in the forms that I just reviewed. If it was less than or equal to 25% change, or if there was a low significance value, then we categorize that as weak. And if it was equivocal, that means that the data indicates that there's no clear trend present. So we can't say that a biologically based farming system outperforms a conventional farming system or vice versa at this point. Okay, those, as I review this table, you're going to see some of the findings are listed in blue. Those are positive findings. And then if it's listed in red, those are negative findings, meaning if it's a positive finding, the diversification of the farming system provided greater benefits for the service or indicator than the conventional practices. And if it's in red, it's a negative finding, meaning that diversification or the diversified farming practice provided fewer benefits for the indicator. So let's review. And I will speak to first a summary of the biophysical impacts on farming systems. So when it came to biological diversification and comparison of biologically diversified to conventional farming systems, the studies that are available to date consistently show that soil quality, as measured by soil organic matter, key physical, chemical and biological characteristics, rates of erosion, etc. Those that soil quality set of indicators is enhanced through biological diversification, so showing a strong positive effect. So as we diversify the farming system with ecologically based farming practices, there is a strong positive effect on key soil quality indicators. An important thing, as I mentioned before, is nutrient leaching. So when we look at the literature comparing conventional and biologically based and diversified farming systems, we see a positive but weak effect with diversification. So the examples are largely based on the comparison of conventional and organic farming systems, and what the literature shows is that there is a weak but positive impact, and that organic farming systems tend to have lower levels of nutrient loss or nutrient leaching from them. The next one says P leaching, that's phosphorus leaching, again drawing upon comparisons of conventional versus organic farming systems. The literature is not yet mature, and so at present we cannot say that organic farming systems or conventional farming systems are performing at a higher level. When we plant or maintain non-crop vegetation along riparian corridors, preventing nutrients from flowing into those riparian systems, as compared to those farming systems that have no riparian buffer, you see a significant decrease in the amount of nutrients that are entering these farming systems when there is a form of biological diversification in the example of a riparian buffer. So when we have non-crop vegetation planted with the objective of reducing nutrient flow into freshwater ecosystems like creeks or rivers, you see a very strong positive effect in reducing nutrient loss and eutrophication. Water use efficiency, and that is tied to the first indicator. You see very much higher water use efficiency in biologically based and diversified farming systems, and that has to do with the fact that biologically based farming systems or organic farming systems tend to rely on organic matter cycling, tend to have higher rates of organic matter in the soil, and as a result have a higher water holding capacity and water use efficiency. Soil organic matter has the ability to hold and retain large volumes of water, and that is why they enhanced water holding capacity and water use efficiency. So let's look at biotic interactions. So again, looking at the state of the science, we see that when we compare biologically diversified farming systems to conventional farming systems, we see higher rates of biological diversity of arthropods and plants and other small organisms. Also in biologically diversified farming systems, you see natural control of weed populations. There's a strong positive effect with biological diversification and natural regulation of weeds. Control of plant pathogens, aerial plant pathogens, a strong positive effect. Soil pathogens, also positive, but a weaker effect. The control of arthropod pests at a local scale, meaning at a field scale. When you have a diversified farming system, you see a positive but weak effect, meaning there's higher rates of natural pest control in biologically based and biologically diversified farming systems. When you have a agricultural landscape that has a high level of diversity, it's still unclear at present whether or not diversity at a landscape scale has a positive impact on natural pest regulation. For pollination services, and there we're talking about enhanced populations of pollinator species. We see that with biological diversification of farming systems, and we're talking about those farming systems that are managed organically and have a wide range of different forms of diversification in space and time, we see a positive but weak effect with enhanced pollination services under biologically diversified farming systems. So getting specifically to climate change adaptation and mitigation now. So these are the indicators that we were able to observe from the scientific literature that have its strongest bearing on climate change adaptation and mitigation. And the findings are significant. So when it comes to carbon sequestration as a form of climate mitigation, organic or these biologically diversified, biologically based farming systems tend to sequester larger amounts of carbon, as represented in the percent carbon in the soil. They tend to use energy much more efficiently, use less energy overall, and use energy more efficiently in most products in producing foods. The total global warming potential, if you measure up all of the greenhouse gases that are coming from biologically based and diversified farming systems compared to conventional farming systems, that literature is still not fully mature, and so at present we have to say that literature findings are equivocal. In terms of resilience to drought, a form of adaptation in farming systems because of the higher rates of carbon sequestration, higher rates of organic matter content. The resilience to drought is enhanced in biologically based and organic farming systems because of the high water holding capacity of these soils that are under organic management. Resistance to other forms of extreme weather, though that literature is limited, that literature strongly indicates that with biological diversification, with the use of organic farming practices, the resistance to extreme weather events like hurricanes is significantly enhanced. Okay, let's get to now the last major ecosystem service, and that has to do with yield. So when we compare organic to conventional farming systems, you see a weak negative effect with biological diversification. So in summary, what we can say at present is that organic farming systems tend to yield less than conventional agricultural systems. On average, it's about 19%. But I'll discuss the political and economic context in which we should understand these differences. In developing nations, when we're dealing with resource-poor farmers who are relying on relatively simple farming practices, if we increase the sophistication of their production practices by training them to use basic organic farming or diversified farming practices, then we can increase their productivity significantly. Let me now explain a few details around this question of yield because it's so important to many. So a recent study by Ponisio et al., this is a group of colleagues at UC Berkeley, reviewed the existing literature looking at these yield comparisons between conventional and organic farming systems. And what can we say now about them? So there was 115 studies that were evaluated. There included over 1,000 different comparisons of organic and conventional yields under different experimental conditions in 38 countries and 52 different crop species. And so as I mentioned, the average yield differential is about 19%. So organic farming systems on average yield about 19% lower than conventional farming systems, but I want to explain a few details. So the yields are about 19% less, but when you begin to look at that data even closer, one of the things that you find is the greatest yield gap is found with key commodity crops, meaning like rice and corn in wheat, in cotton, and other commodity crops that have undergone significant research and development over the last 50 to 70 years. So we would expect some yield differential between organic and conventional farming systems because, as I will explain, there's been significant differences in the amount of research and development dollars that have gone into breeding for those two different kinds of systems. One of the important things to understand is when we look at these yield figures, it's important to understand that when we begin to actually utilize diversification practices such as multi-cropping and the integration of crop rotation, that 19% yield differential begins to diminish significantly. So when we add a multi-cropping or a polyculture type of strategy into these comparative analyses, then the differential in yield drops to approximately 9% or less, or slightly more in some instances. And then when we begin to factor in the positive impacts of crop rotation on overall yield, then that average yield differential drops to about 8% plus or minus 5%. So there are significant ways that we can increase the productivity of these biologically based farming systems by using our understanding of ecology. So it's important to understand that on average about 19% yield differential exists between these organic and conventional farming systems, but that yield differential can be reduced or in some cases eliminated with ecologically based farming strategies. Okay, so as I mentioned, cereals, things that have received hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars of research and development funds over the last 70 years. That's where you see the greatest yield gap because organic farming systems or agroecological farming systems have received nowhere near the same amount of research and development funding. So it's possible to increase the amount of yield from organic or ecologically based farming systems, but additional research and development dollars would need to be allocated. Okay, so in summary, we found substantial evidence of these significant advantages of these biologically based or organic farming systems across a wide range of globally important ecological services, and that includes those listed here: biological conservation, natural pest control, pollination services, soil quality enhancement or maintenance, carbon sequestration, water use efficiency, energy use efficiency, resistance to extreme weather events, and a relatively high yield based on the fact that organic farming systems and biologically based and diversified farming systems have received very little research and development dollars. Recently, after we produced our quantitative synthesis, recent work just came out by John Reganold and one of his colleagues, and this was just published in Nature Plants, and this takes our analysis to another level. And so this illustration shows a wide range of outcomes from different types of farming systems, and here you see again a comparison of conventional agricultural systems as compared to organic farming systems. And so he evaluated the scientific literature looking at what types of performance levels can we derive from the scientific literature when we compare these two farming systems over a 40-year time period. So John Reganold and his colleague produced this recent summary, and I want to briefly review it here. So let's start with profitability in the kind of lower right. So the longer the stave in this amoeba diagram, the greater the performance of the system. So John Reganold and other colleagues just recently published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences that in fact organic farming systems are more profitable on a global level than conventional farming systems. So you have higher levels of profitability in these organic farming systems. The total costs are roughly equivalent, moving to the left around the circle. The ecosystem services, as I just reviewed in detail, and John draws extensively from our work, is ecosystem services from agricultural ecosystems are much higher in organic farming systems. The employment of workers, because there is a higher labor demand in organic farming systems, you see the employment of workers being higher in organic farming systems, but again, the total cost being roughly equivalent. A very positive outcome is reduced worker exposure to pesticides, so that's significantly better in organic farming systems. Minimizing pesticide residues, and that's in reference to the foods that we consume. So pesticide residues are minimized in these organic farming systems. Nutritional quality, that might come as a surprise to some, but the research that John and many of his colleagues have done has shown that there's higher concentrations of essential nutrients in organically produced foods. As I just discussed, there is a yield differential. Organic farming systems tend to yield lower than conventional farming systems, but there's a number of reasons that I've described that is the case. Soil quality is much higher in organic farming systems for the reasons that I discussed. And important to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, energy use is significantly lower in organic farming systems, higher rates of biodiversity, and as previously discussed, lower rates of water pollution, all from organic farming systems. So this is a very tidy summary of about 40 years of research summarizing literally hundreds of different scientific studies, and this provides us with I think a very useful snapshot of how these two different farming systems perform, and in the context of climate change, which types of farming systems might help us with climate change adaptation and mitigation and reaching other environmental performance goals and protection of public health goals that we may want to achieve. So I also want to just briefly say a few things about the political and economic context. So we've just reviewed that organic and these biologically diversified farming systems outperform conventional farming systems across a wide range of environmental performance metrics. But it's important to understand the political and economic context in which that level of performance has been able to be achieved. So this is recent work that a colleague and I did in 2012 and 2013, and it shows the major research branches of the U.S. Department of Agriculture that provide research funding for farming systems development, and you see it includes the National Economic Research Service and others, and you see to the upper left that the fraction that goes to researching and developing organic farming systems is a minuscule fraction of the total research, education, and economic budget of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So I present this in order to understand that we have these farming systems, these organic or biologically based farming systems that have shown a level of environmental performance that far exceeds conventional farming systems, but they've been able to do that being almost entirely neglected by the research, education, and extension budget of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And so this points to the promise of organic and biologically based farming systems in terms of enhancing their performance were we to channel adequate amounts of resources in that direction. This is recent research based on 2014 data that colleagues at the Union of Concerned Scientists and I just published. On the left-hand side, you see the large gray bubble. That's the total U.S. Department of Agriculture budget at $157 billion. The research, education, and economic budget, that is in the dark blue, the smaller bubble, that's $2.8 billion. That's a total research, education, and economics research budget. And so what we did is we explored through a data analysis of the current research information systems database what projects could be designated as involving any element of sustainable agriculture, organic farming, or agroecology. And so what we found is that in 2014, the total set of projects that advanced sustainable agriculture in any way whatsoever, and that included just reducing conventional inputs into conventional farming systems, that was about $203 million. So a very small fraction of the total research, education, and economics budget dedicated to research goes to advancing sustainable agriculture. If you really begin to dig deeper to qualify which projects involve sophisticated forms of agroecological research, like I provided an example with the push-pull system, that amount of money drops to 44 million of a total $2.8 billion in research funding. And if you're looking at the total amount of money that's allocated to projects that involve not just agroecological practices but are designed to create both farming systems and food systems that address issues of inequality in food access and social justice, then we're talking about projects totaling only about 12 million of a $2.8 billion research, education, and economics budget. So a very small amount of research and development dollars from the U.S. Department of Agriculture is being directed toward any type of research and development for sustainable agriculture, agroecology, and food system transformation, including climate change adaptation and mitigation. So we have a significant amount of change that would need to happen within the U.S. Department of Agriculture to address some of the pressing issues we face in terms of long-term ecological sustainability and climate change adaptation and mitigation. So in summary, I think it's important to point out that we have examples of farming systems that perform quite well under a range of environmental circumstances, that perform well under the anticipated conditions of global climate change, that reduce water use, that are far more water use efficient, that reduce the amount of energy and overall environmental externalities from agriculture, which are significant, including greenhouse gas emissions. Organic farming systems and biologically based farming systems are also known to sequester greater amounts of carbon. All of those things point to the fact that if we were to increase the amount of research, education, and economics budget of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, society would realize even greater social and ecological performance from these systems and help us mitigate and adapt to global climate change. And with that, I will pause here for questions and answers.